Greetings, it is I, Tentus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome back to Dungeons & Dragons 5e, the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons 5th Ed D&D. Of course, where we last left off all that while ago, again, apologies for the long delay in videos, we were talking about stuff in the DMG. We'd gotten to talking about running combat as the DM of a group, and that's where we're going to dive back into today. Today, we're going to, of course, start with talking about using miniatures a little bit more, and then talk about some optional rules that you'll use in your D&D 5th edition games. Let's dive into it. So, we were talking last time about running a combat as a DM, and we left off speaking about the area of effects and adjudicating them when it comes to large groups, which leads us into our next thing that we want to talk about: handling mobs of creatures, because sometimes you can find that you're fighting a large group of enemies. Whether this means you're fighting a phalanx of enemies from a battle, one on many, or for whatever reasons you're on a crowded battlefield where a lot of attacks are going to come at you, rolling a lot of dice is difficult to do. You'll be rolling a lot of d20s, taking a lot of time. It's annoying. So there's a way that we can mitigate this, that we can make the combat incredibly faster. And fortunately, the book has this. There's a nice handy-dandy chart. We'd have to do some math before you look at the chart. First, we take and we subtract the attack bonus of whatever creature or group of creatures that we're talking about from the target's AC. So if your fighter has an AC of 18 and a bunch of creatures with +5 bonus are heading them, we get a number of 13. So this is the number that they would need to roll minimum on a d20 in order to hit your PC. That's what we take and go to the chart with. We basically can use the chart to see how many creatures we need to get one attack in. Now, from this chart here, a 13 or 14 gets you every 3 creatures, one will successfully hit. With that AC of 18 and that +5 bonus, for every 3 of these creatures that I have fighting this person, one will hit it. So if I have 9 creatures fighting them, 9 orc warriors will say, 3 will hit the target. Effectively, all of them are combining their efforts to attack this one target and get as many attacks in as possible, smacking them as much as needed. We have now gotten rid of the need for a d20 roll. We've used the law of averages in the chart here to figure out how many creatures we would need, how many attacks against this target we would need for some successful hits. So this combined effort allows for this. And again, we can do the law of average damages, which speeds this up also. So now that we can figure out how much damage this group of 9 orcs will deal against our player character, our hero, with their combined group of attacks. If you would have an odd number, for example, if you would have 7 or 8, those extras, that 1 extra or 2 extra, wouldn't count. It's for every 3. Any extras would just miss entirely. Now, if there are, within this group of creatures, some that have the same attack bonus but different amounts of damage, you will assume those that deal the most damage are going to hit and be successful at hitting. Effectively, the rest of the group will leave openings for this one that can get the best hit in to smack into your players. If a creature would have multiple attacks, they use the same bonus, and you're using multiple attacks, assume all of them hit for when you have the one creature hit. If they are different bonuses, you're going to have to consider those different bonuses separately, and effectively separate sets of attacks. This system is definitely in favor of using no die rolls. It ignores critical hits from even existing. And the fact is that you're going to use this system until the numbers of enemies dwindle down to something that's more reasonable to switch back to actual die rolls. So when my group of 9 orcs is reduced down to like maybe 3, I might want to switch back to actual dice rolls. Granted, it's going to be up to you entirely when you feel is appropriate to switch off of here and to kind of organically switch into normal combat from this just straight diceless combat. Now, we've talked a few times about using miniatures. I've talked about how they're actually a really great tool for visualization, that if you're having problems figuring out what's going on a map and visualizing the situation, a tactical map of some kind using miniatures can help a lot. And miniatures takes a lot of forms. The most simple is just a grid on something like a dry erase board or a piece of cardboard or something that you put miniatures on, and that's it. That's most simple. And you can go as complex as you want. You can build 3D models, you can build drawings on like vinyl mats or dry erase mats where you can get rid of it afterwards with markers drawing up things. You can construct any kind of dungeon however you want. It's up to you entirely how much you want to go complex or simply when you're just trying to use miniatures. But this definitely helps with visualization. The idea is, though, you're going to be using squares. It's 1-inch squares. That's the simplest way, that each 1-inch square is representing 5 feet of the area you're using. This is the simplest of all the representations you can use. And you could, of course, put this together on whatever form you want. Again, sky's the limit of how creative you want to be in building these. Now, there are some other details we can talk about. You can use a map that's kind of been built by you that doesn't have a grid on it. Now, this adds a level of difficulty in figuring it out because you have to either use like a measuring tape, craft sticks, pipe cleaners, anything that can allow you to figure out where specific lengths are, effectively an inch being 5 feet again, and just measuring it out. Standard miniatures are built for that, inches 5 feet. So just a note on that, for most miniatures you can buy from stores, whether official Dungeons & Dragons one or unofficial ones, tend to have that size. Another option, though, is also hexagons. 1-inch hexagons can exist, and we'll be talking a little about using those too. Those do allow for some more flexible building of your grid. It makes it easier to measure things out, but the problem is that walls of dungeons and various other places tend to be straight. Hexagons don't fit very well with them. Now, there are some rules for hexagons and squares that we're talking about when we're using miniatures that you have to keep in mind. Size. Every creature is going to have a standard size that it will have for its squares, or even hexagons, and they are listed in the book. A good example would be a medium creature is 1 square and 1 hexagon. A gargantuan creature is a 16 squares, a 4x4 area, or possibly more, and would be 12 hexagons or more for hexagons, while tiny creatures you could fit 4 per square or 4 per hexagon. You see, there's big differences, and knowing those differences is important. Regardless of how big the actual creatures is, how big the miniatures is, you should keep this information in mind, because I could use a huge miniatures that's larger than a 3x3, which is the one for the huge, but it should take up that according to the actual board I'm putting in. Or if it's smaller, it still takes up by that 3x3. This is the way that it's the official size, so whether your miniature represents that exactly doesn't matter. This is the size that it comes in for the rules. When it comes to area effect, it translates into squares or hexes pretty decently. You use an intersection as a point of origin and then just measure that. If it is at least covering half of a square or hexagon, it affects it. So a area effect could touch a square or touch a hexagon. Guess what? You're not going to be affected by it. It's whether it's kind of engulfing it at least 50%. Line of sight is another thing that we have to worry about determining. If you're determining it between 2 spaces, you pick a corner from one of these spaces and just draw imaginary lines to any corner of that other space. This works the same for squares and hexagons, and if it doesn't get blocked by something, if it doesn't pass through an object that would block vision, guess what? You can see it. So this means since you're drawing it from one corner to any corner, it's pretty easy to see something, as long as there's not like a wall in the way completely blocking it. This is also going to be used for cover. You're going to use that one corner to corner, but in a different kind of way, because cover, you have to determine from the point of origin of the effect. You choose a corner on your attacker, or the person you're looking for to see if you've got cover against, and drawing it to every corner of the target. That's the important difference. One corner for line of sight, every corner for cover. If 1 or 2 of them is blocked in a square, you got half cover. If 3 or 4 are blocked, but you can still see the target, there are examples of this in things like arrow slits, it has 3/4 cover. For hexagons, it's a little bit more exact, that if the target has half cover, if it's 3 lines are blocked, and 3/4 cover if 4 or more lines are blocked. So you can see that a hexagon, you can block a few lines, but not have it cover. Now there's a couple of optional rules we'll handle here for combat before we finish up for today. The first is flanking. Flanking is a way of giving simple advantage in combat. Flanking can affect both attackers and defenders, your heroes or your monsters. It's gaining advantage in combat. You have to be able to see it, you can't be incapacitated, and larger creatures are flanked as long as one square qualifies for flanking within their big body. These are important details to know about. And there are details very differently whether you're flanking on squares or hexagons. For squares, you have to have an ally adjacent to the enemy and on the opposite side or opposite corner of the enemy to where you are on the grid. That's pretty simple. Then it has basically this melee advantage and attacks. The way you do this, if you doubt whether something has flanking, you draw an imaginary line through the center of all the creature's spaces. If the line passes through the opposite sides or corners of the enemy space, it flanks. So I draw a line through all three, and that's how I figure it out. And if that line seems to be like, oh, it's going across all the squares, so it's going like diagonally across the two corners of this, there you go, you're flanking. Hex is a little more difficult, but you can do it with some very quick and easy maths to figure out if you have advantages. You count around how many hexes between you and the other person are on this creature. If there are 2 hexes between them, hey, guess what? You're flanking. That's as simple as it is. So if I put my hex here of my attacker, my other hex as the defender, count 2 in between them, flanking. Larger creatures have their own numbers. Large creatures are 4, huge creatures 5, and gargantuan creatures you have to at least have 6 in between you. Now, the next optional rule I want to talk about is diagonals. On a traditional board in 5th edition D&D, a diagonal is 5 feet. It's as simple as that. I can move up, down, diagonal on my grid, and all of it is 5 feet. This is, in fact, inaccurate. It breaks the laws of geometry. It's inaccurate over large distances. But we're not looking for realism when we're using the basic rules. You can add in the level of realism that counts diagonals, but it's important to note that when you're doing that, you're adding more math and more work to you for doing it. If you want to do that, though, when talking about diagonals, the first diagonal counts as 5 feet, the second diagonal count as 10 feet. This pattern of 5 and 10 continues indefinitely as long as you're traveling diagonally. And it travels whether or not you're breaking it up in the same movement. It's assuming that the same movement is always going to be the same 30 feet or less than 30 feet, and it's going to be the same amount you can place per turn. So in between turns, diagonals get reset. Hey, that's great for you. But within the same movement, if I move diagonally 5 feet, move like another 10 feet, and then move another diagonal square, that second one is going to be 10. Regardless if I took it right away, or I took it one after another. If I took it, moved around somewhat where I'm doing horizontal or vertically, and then move diagonally again, yes, that extra movement will still be 10 feet, so that the movement total is always the same when it comes to diagonals, while I'm within my, let's say, 30 feet if I'm a human. Now, the last optional rule that I want to talk about today to finish up is facing. Facing is a thing that makes sense logically. A creature is facing a certain way when it comes to combat. It is another one that if you add it on as an optional rule, it's adding extra work. Most of these optional rules add something extra if you actually want to use them. For facing, effectively you have a front arc, its front, 2 side arcs, and a rear arc. And you change your facing as a reaction to any other creature movement. That does allow you to do that, so you can kind of change this, like if something moves up behind you, you can quickly face it. Or when you're done moving, you can change its facing there. So I end my move, choose my facing. Oh, I have a reaction that I can change facing also. So you can normally like fight to things to your front or your sides. You really can't see in your rear arc, can't see behind you. Creatures that attack you from behind have advantages. Shields only apply to a front arc and the same side arc that you're carrying your shield with. Pretty simplistic there. And not every creature has every archetype, or some of them have very different archetypes. Things that are amorphous, like oozes, would only have front arcs. They can only see in front of them. They don't have it. While some other ones would have unique rules depending on the creature type, its body type, things like that, that you determine how to put these together. Hex is a little more difficult because you kind of have to judge it. You kind of pick a creature's side and kind of put a wedge shape expanding out from there, kind of in the middle of it. It's a little more difficult, but you can add siding to hexes. It's just, a little confusing. And effectively, then you're kind of figuring out your front, back, and sides with that one. Now, if you're kind of drawing into it and you're using this and you draw into a square or hex with your arc when determining whether it's in one side or the other, the imaginary lines do go out kind of indefinitely for front sides, for mattering which it's on, which sometimes, again, makes a difference. If I'm getting ranged attack far away to the side I've got my shield, hey, that matters whether they're at the side or my rear. So if whichever one it's more in is the one that is in that arc. That's the first thing. So if you've got a square or a hex that's more into one arc than another, that's the one it's in. If it's exactly split down the middle, if it's half in the front and half in the side, it's in the front. If it's half in the side and half in the rear, it's in the side. It's in the side. It favors better for the defender in a way, for the creature that you're looking at the siding for in a way. The last thing I want to talk about to finish up the basics of combat as running it as a DM today is, of course, reaction times. The basic reaction times you're going to have are opportunity attacks and ready actions. Those are the two normal ones that most characters will have. And now there are some class features, spells, and special abilities that do give you other reaction times, but figuring out how they work together, how they function, and how they fit with reacting to something is kind of difficult. You kind of have to follow the reaction's description, the ability's description. Like opportunity attacks, they're in reaction to something happening. So when something happens, you take it. The shield spell, it's in reaction to an attack that's coming in. It's interrupting that attack. I'm raising a magic shield to block an attack. That explains where it's at in the trigger. Other ones don't specify things as well, and you as the DM are going to have to kind of use your good judgment to kind of figure out where it fits in and how it reacts to things, and how it triggers in response to the action, when this wing will trigger and finish in response to what's going on. And this especially is difficult with ready actions, because you're readying to do something. It'll probably depend on how they readied it, what they're readying it for, and things like that. And that's it for today. So we talked about a lot of things when it came to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and running combats. We talked about large groups of enemies and some ways that you can run those and still make it efficient for your games. We talked, of course, about using miniatures for your games and tactical maps, whether you like squares or hexes, and the differences between using the two of those. Of course, we talked about how the effects of these will deal with a lot of things like effects, line of sight, cover, and all that you'll have to deal with when it comes to those maps. And finally, we finished up, of course, talking about some optional rules. Personally, I don't usually use flanking for 5th edition D&D. I feel like it does give some great bonuses to your characters, but it's a kind of give and take. Enemies often can take advantage of it more, depending on the situation, the combats you build. Similarly, I'm a square person when it comes to miniatures, and I do like a good miniatures board depending on the combat and depending on the situation. Sometimes it calls for miniatures, and it calls for those squares. Hexes, I don't mind them, but I don't use them. As for the other optional rules, I'm fine with avoiding diagonals and the extra math of it when it comes to 5th edition. It's extra math, and unless you want that realism, I don't deal with the extra math. If a system calls for the diagonals, like Pathfinder does, the 5 then 10 pattern, then yeah, I do that. And facing, I didn't even consider until we talked about it. Until 5th edition brought it up as an optional rule. So that's entirely up to you if you want to use that entire extra level of realism to your miniatures battle. But just note, a lot of these optional rules and the way that you'd handle miniatures will determine how long a combat takes and how worth it is to use the miniatures. You're going to have to plan accordingly to see what is best for your group, how long you want your combats to go, and how well you want things to balance. A long combat can be fun, but it can also take up a lot of your session. So just remember all these things when we're talking about using any of these optional rules. And of course, using your squares and hexes. But anyway, I hope you have a great day. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and of course comment down below on this video. It helps support it. Other ways that you can support is check out my links below. Of course, there's things like the Discord channel, which is a good place to reach me, find out what's going on. The Patreon, which is a great way of showing some support for me to continue edited videos and also look into maybe getting an editor for better quality edited videos at some point in the future. I'm only one man, I can only do so much. And have yourself a great rest of the day, and I hope we see you here next time when we continue talking about it, talking about combat a little bit more. And until then, I bid you farewell.